I never thought a piece of paper from 1947 would save my entire property. But when the Homeowners Association came knocking with their threats and fines, that yellow document became my shield against what turned into the most insane battle of my life. My name is Vincent Malone, and I bought my house on Hickory Lane in Roswell, Georgia, 3 years ago. The place was a dream, a sprawling ranch-style home on 2 acres with mature oak trees and a creek running through the back of the property. The previous owner, an elderly man named Harold, had lived there for 60 years. He told me stories about how the area used to be farmland, how he remembered when there were only 3 houses on the entire road. I loved those stories. I loved the history. What I didn't know was that history would become my greatest weapon. When I moved in, there was no HOA. None. The neighborhood was a mix of older homes like mine and some newer constructions, but everyone minded their own business. I could paint my fence whatever color I wanted, park my truck in the driveway, and let my grass grow to whatever height suited me. It was freedom, the American dream, without some petty tyrant telling me what color my mailbox should be. That all changed on a Tuesday morning in March when I found a letter in my mailbox. The envelope was cream-colored, expensive-looking, with the return address printed in raised lettering. Hickory Lane Homeowners Association. My stomach dropped. I stood there at the end of my driveway, holding this thing like it was a bomb, because in a way it was. I ripped it open. The letter was professionally formatted, cold and impersonal. It informed me that due to recent rezoning by Fulton County, my property now fell within the boundaries of the Hickory Lane HOA. As such, I was required to pay back dues of $3,000 covering the past 6 months, plus ongoing monthly fees of $200. Furthermore, I needed to bring my property into compliance with their covenants, conditions, and restrictions within 30 days. The list of violations made my blood boil. My fence was the wrong color, my mailbox wasn't regulation style, I had a commercial vehicle parked in my driveway, my lawn exceeded the maximum grass height of 3 inches, and I had an unapproved shed in my backyard. Every single thing they listed was something I specifically loved about not having an HOA. I looked up at my house, my sanctuary, and felt genuine rage building in my chest. The letter was signed by Deborah Patterson, HOA president. Of course it was a Deborah. I could already picture her. Middle-aged, blonde highlights, that particular haircut that screamed, "I want to speak to your manager." Probably drove a white SUV with those stick-figure family decals. I crumpled the letter in my fist and marched back inside. That evening, I did my research. The rezoning had indeed happened. Fulton County had redrawn some boundary lines to accommodate new development on the eastern edge of Roswell. My property, which had previously sat just outside the planned community boundaries, now technically fell within them, but something didn't sit right. I had specifically asked about HOAs when I bought the house. My real estate agent had assured me there was none. I dug out my closing documents, spending hours going through every page. That's when I found it. Buried in the deed, in language so archaic I had to read it 3 times to understand, was a clause. The property at 4782 Hickory Lane was granted an exemption from any and all community association requirements, in perpetuity, as part of the original 1947 subdivision agreement. The land had been subdivided from a larger farm, and my parcel, because it contained the original farmhouse and a natural water source, had been specifically exempted from future association requirements to preserve its historical significance. I sat back in my chair, a slow smile spreading across my face. They couldn't touch me. The next morning I called the number on the HOA letter, A chipper voice answered. Hickory Lane HOA, this is Brenda speaking. Hi Brenda, this is Vincent Malone at 4782 Hickory Lane. I received a letter yesterday about joining the HOA, and I need to speak with Deborah Patterson. Oh yes, Mr. Malone. Mrs. Patterson has been expecting your call. Please hold. The hold music was some instrumental version of a pop song I couldn't quite place. Then, a new voice cut through, sharp and nasal. Mr. Malone, this is Deborah Patterson. I trust you received our letter regarding your property compliance issues. I did, and I'm calling to inform you that my property is exempt from HOA requirements. There's a clause in my deed from 1947 that specifically exempts this land from any association requirements in perpetuity. There was a pause. Then, a condescending laugh. Mr. Malone, I'm sure you think you found something, but that's not how this works. The rezoning supersedes any previous agreements. The county has placed your property within our boundaries, which means you're subject to our rules. Now, we can either do this the easy way or the hard way. Pay your dues, fix your violations, and we'll welcome you to the community. Or refuse and we'll file a lien against your property. My jaw clenched. You can't file a lien against a property that's not part of your association. We'll see about that, Mr. Malone. You have 30 days. She hung up. I stood there with the phone in my hand, fury and disbelief warring in my chest. She hadn't even listened, hadn't even pretended to care about what I was saying. This was about power, pure and simple. She wanted to force compliance, and she didn't care about the law or history or anything else. Fine. If she wanted to do this the hard way, we'd do it the hard way. I spent the rest of that day calling attorneys. Most real estate lawyers I spoke with seemed hesitant, saying HOA cases were complicated and expensive. The 8th attorney I called, though, was different. His name was Richard Chen, and he practiced property law with a specialty in historical property rights and deed restrictions. Mr. Malone, he said after I explained my situation, I'd like to see that deed. Can you scan it and email it to me? I did, right there while on the phone with him. I heard him humming as he read through it. This is fascinating, he said. This kind of exemption is rare but absolutely binding. If what you're telling me is accurate, and the language here suggests it is, then your property cannot be forced into an HOA regardless of rezoning. Rezoning affects land use and zoning classifications, but it doesn't override deed restrictions or exemptions. Those run with the land. So I'm protected, you're protected, but that doesn't mean they won't try to make your life hell. HOAs can be relentless, especially when their authority is challenged. Are you prepared for a fight? After that phone call with Deborah, absolutely. Good, I'll take your case. Let's send them a formal letter explaining your position. If they persist, we'll be ready. 2 days later, Richard sent a certified letter to the HOA, explaining in detailed legal language that my property was exempt from their jurisdiction due to the perpetual exemption clause in the original 1947 deed. He cited relevant Georgia property law and included copies of the deed with the exemption highlighted. The letter concluded by requesting that the HOA cease all collection efforts and remove my property from their records. I thought that would be the end of it. I was naive. A week passed with no response. Then, on a Saturday morning, I was woken up by the sound of machinery. I stumbled out of bed and looked out my window to see a tow truck backing into my driveway. A woman stood on my lawn, pointing at my work truck and talking on her phone. I recognized her from her Facebook photo on the HOA page I had stalked. Deborah Patterson in the flesh. I threw on jeans and a shirt and ran outside. Hey, what the hell are you doing? Deborah turned to me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She was exactly as I had pictured, mid-50s, expensive athleisure wear, that haircut. Mr. Malone, good morning. Your commercial vehicle is in violation of HOA regulations. Since you've refused to remove it, we're removing it for you. You can collect it from the impound lot once you've paid your fines. You can't do that. You have no authority here. I have every authority. You're part of the HOA whether you like it or not. The tow truck driver, a younger guy who looked uncomfortable, was hooking up my truck. I ran over to him. Stop, you're stealing my vehicle. This woman has no legal right to authorize this. He hesitated, looking between me and Deborah. Lady, is this legit? I don't want to be part of something illegal. Deborah marched over, her phone in her hand. I have the HOA authorization right here. This vehicle is in violation, and we have the right to remove code violations from HOA properties. This isn't an HOA property. I was shouting now. Neighbors were coming out of their houses, watching. I have a legal exemption. My attorney sent you a letter explaining this. Your attorney sent me a bunch of nonsense about old paperwork that doesn't apply anymore. Now step aside, or I'll call the police for interfering with authorized HOA business. I pulled out my phone and called Richard Chen. It was 8 a.m. on a Saturday, but he answered on the third ring. I quickly explained what was happening. Put me on speaker, he said. I did, holding the phone out. This is Richard Chen, attorney for Vincent Malone. To whom am I speaking? Deborah crossed her arms. Deborah Patterson, HOA president. Mrs. Patterson, I sent you a legal notice regarding Mr. Malone's property exemption. Are you aware that towing a vehicle from private property without the owner's consent, when you have no legal authority over that property, constitutes theft? I have authority. The HOA has authority. No, you don't. And if that tow truck removes Mr. Malone's vehicle, I will immediately call the Roswell Police Department and file a theft report. Then I'll file a civil suit against you personally and the HOA for conversion, trespass, and harassment. The damages will be substantial. Is that really what you want? The tow truck driver was already unhooking my truck. Yeah, I'm out, he said. I'm not getting involved in this. Lady, you need to sort out your legal issues before you call for a tow. He climbed back in his truck and drove away. Deborah's face had turned red. This isn't over, Mr. Malone. You can't just ignore the HOA. We have rules and you will follow them. Get off my property, I said quietly, and don't come back without a court order. You'll be hearing from our attorney. She turned on her heel and stalked back to her white Mercedes SUV. Of course it was a Mercedes. Richard was still on the phone. Vincent, document everything. Take photos, keep every letter, record any interactions if Georgia's a one-party consent state, which it is. She's going to escalate. Thanks for picking up. I owe you one. Just doing my job. But be careful. People like that don't back down easily. He was right. Over the next 2 weeks, the harassment intensified. I received daily letters from the HOA, each one more threatening than the last. They claimed I owed $5,000 now with late fees added. They sent notices of hearings I wasn't invited to and posted violation notices on my door. Someone, and I had my suspicions who, called the county code enforcement office and reported that I had unpermitted structures on my property. That resulted in a visit from a county inspector, who thankfully confirmed that my shed was grandfathered in and required no permit. Then they went after my lawn. I came home from work one day to find a landscaping crew mowing my grass. Not just mowing it, scalping it down to bare dirt in places. I ran out of my car, yelling at them to stop. The crew chief, looking embarrassed, explained that the HOA had hired them to bring my lawn into compliance and that they'd bill me for the service. I didn't authorize this. This is trespassing. Man, we're just doing what we were hired to do. Take it up with the HOA. They left, and I was standing in my yard looking at my destroyed lawn. I took dozens of photos and immediately called Richard Chen. "They're escalating," Richard said grimly. "This is actually good for us in a legal sense. Every action they take builds our case." "But I understand it's stressful. Let me file a motion for a temporary restraining order. We'll get a court date and put a stop to this." The next day, Richard filed for a TRO in Fulton County Superior Court, requesting that the HOA be ordered to cease all collection efforts, trespassing, and harassment pending a full hearing on the validity of my deed exemption. We got a court date for 2 weeks out. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept going over everything in my head. The exemption was clear. The law was on my side, but Deborah and her HOA acted like they were above the law. What scared me most was how far she seemed willing to go. This wasn't just about dues or rules anymore. It felt personal for her, like she couldn't stand the idea of someone in her neighborhood not being under her control. The harassment continued. My mailbox was vandalized, the post knocked over. Someone filed a false complaint with the health department claiming I had raw sewage on my property. That resulted in another inspection, another waste of my time proving the complaint was baseless. I started feeling paranoid, checking my security cameras constantly, wondering what they'd do next. Then, a week before our court date, things took a darker turn. I came home to find a letter, not from the HOA but from a law firm, Patterson, Whitmore and Associates. I stared at the return address and realized Deborah's husband was a lawyer, and his firm was now representing the HOA in the case. The letter was a formal legal threat. It claimed that my continued refusal to comply with HOA regulations was causing harm to property values in the neighborhood and creating a public nuisance. They were demanding I immediately pay all dues and fines, which now totaled over $8,000 with their newly added legal fees. Or they would file a lawsuit seeking not only the money, but also a court order forcing me to comply with all HOA regulations or face the sale of my property to satisfy the debt. I called Richard immediately. Can they do this? Can her husband's firm represent the HOA when she's the president? It's a conflict of interest ethically, but not necessarily illegal. It does show how desperate they are, though. They're circling the wagons. This is good for us, Vincent. Let them overplay their hand. The court date arrived on a humid morning in early May. I met Richard at the Fulton County Courthouse, an imposing building in downtown Atlanta. I was nervous, dressed in the only suit I owned, feeling out of my element. Richard, on the other hand, looked completely at ease in his navy suit, carrying a leather briefcase stuffed with documents. "Remember," he said as we walked up the steps, "stay calm. Let me do the talking. If the judge asks you a direct question, answer truthfully and concisely." We entered the courtroom. It was smaller than I expected, wood-paneled and formal. Deborah was already there with her husband, Marcus Patterson, a tall man with silver hair and an expensive suit. Deborah saw me and her lips pressed into a thin line. Marcus whispered something to her and she looked away. The bailiff called our case. Judge Sandra Martinez presided, a middle-aged Latina woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. Both attorneys approached the bench and introduced themselves. "This is a motion for a temporary restraining order," Judge Martinez said, reviewing the file. "Mr. Chen, you represent the property owner. Explain your client's position." Richard launched into a clear, concise explanation. He described the 1947 deed exemption, the recent rezoning, and the HOA's attempts to force my compliance despite the legal exemption. He detailed the harassment, the attempted vehicle towing, the unauthorized lawn service, the false complaints to government agencies, and the mounting threats. He presented copies of the original deed, highlighting the exemption clause, and cited Georgia property law, establishing that deed restrictions and exemptions run with the land and cannot be superseded by rezoning. Your Honor, Richard concluded, my client has a legal, perpetual exemption from HOA requirements. The respondent's actions constitute trespass, harassment, and potentially theft. We're asking the court to order them to cease all contact and collection efforts pending a full hearing on the merits. Judge Martinez turned to Marcus Patterson. Mr. Patterson, you're arguing that rezoning supersedes a 78-year-old deed exemption. Yes, Your Honor. The county's rezoning in January of this year brought Mr. Malone's property within the HOA boundaries. That's a governmental action that establishes jurisdiction. The HOA has the right, indeed the obligation, to enforce its covenants uniformly across all properties within its boundaries. To allow one property owner to ignore the rules would be unfair to everyone else who complies. But you're not disputing the existence of the exemption clause in the deed. We dispute its current validity, Your Honor. Circumstances have changed dramatically since 1947. The area is now a developed residential community, not farmland. The exemption was based on conditions that no longer exist. Richard stood again. Your Honor, may I respond? Go ahead. The exemption states in perpetuity. That means forever, regardless of changed circumstances. Georgia law is clear that deed restrictions and exemptions are binding on future owners and cannot be eliminated by rezoning or changed land use. The respondent's argument would invalidate virtually every historical deed restriction in the state. That's not how property law works. Judge Martinez studied the deed copy for a long moment. Mr. Patterson, do you have any case law supporting your position that rezoning can override an explicit perpetual exemption in a deed? Marcus shuffled his papers. Your Honor, the case law addresses standard deed restrictions, not exemptions from association membership. This is a unique situation. Unique doesn't mean your client has jurisdiction. Judge Martinez looked up, her expression stern. I've reviewed the deed. The language is unambiguous. The exemption is perpetual and explicitly covers any and all community association requirements. That's about as clear as legal language gets. Mr. Chen is correct that deed restrictions run with the land. Rezoning affects permitted land uses, not private contract rights embedded in deeds. She turned to Deborah and Marcus. Mrs. Patterson, Mr. Patterson, has the HOA been entering onto Mr. Malone's property without permission? Deborah started to speak, but Marcus put a hand on her arm. The HOA has taken actions to enforce compliance with community standards, Your Honor. That's a yes, Judge Martinez said dryly. That's trespassing. You've also attempted to tow his vehicle, which could constitute attempted theft, and you've sent him thousands of dollars in bills for dues and services he never requested, all while knowing he claims a legal exemption. Your Honor, we believed we had authority, Marcus began. Belief doesn't matter. Authority matters, and based on what I'm seeing, you don't have it. Judge Martinez signed a document. I'm granting the temporary restraining order. The Hickory Lane Homeowners Association, its board members and its agents are hereby ordered to cease all contact with Mr. Malone, cease all collection efforts, cease entering his property, and cease taking any actions related to his property pending a full evidentiary hearing. That hearing will be scheduled for. She checked her calendar, June 15th, 4 weeks from now. At that time, we'll make a final determination on the validity of the exemption. But I'll tell you right now, Mr. Patterson, unless you find some compelling legal authority I'm not aware of, your client is going to lose. We left the courtroom. I felt like I could breathe for the first time in weeks. Richard was smiling. "That went well," he said. "Judge Martinez is sharp." She saw through their arguments immediately. "What happens now? Now they have to leave you alone until the hearing. If they violate the restraining order, they'll be in contempt of court. That's serious. Most likely, they'll spend the next 4 weeks trying to find case law to support their position, which they won't, and then we'll go to the full hearing and get a permanent injunction." I thanked him profusely. We parted ways, and I drove back to Roswell feeling lighter than I had in weeks. The TRO was in place. They couldn't touch me for about 2 weeks. There was blessed silence. No letters, no visits, no harassment. I started to relax, to feel like maybe this nightmare was over. I should have known better. I was working in my garage on a Saturday afternoon when a Roswell police cruiser pulled into my driveway. My heart sank. An officer got out, young guy, looking official and serious. "Vincent Malone." "That's me. What's this about?" "Sir, we've received a complaint that you've been harassing members of the Hickory Lane Homeowners Association. Specifically, a Mrs. Deborah Patterson claims you've been sending threatening emails and showed up at her house making threats." My jaw dropped. "That's completely false. I have a restraining order against her and the HOA. I haven't contacted them at all." The officer looked uncertain. "Sir, she showed us emails allegedly from your address." "Can I see them?" He pulled out his phone and showed me screenshots. They were emails, supposedly from my email address, filled with vulgar threats and insults directed at Deborah. The language was crude and threatening. "I'll make you regret crossing me," one read. "You have no idea what I'm capable of," said another. "I didn't send these," I said firmly. "Someone's spoofing my email. Look, I can show you my sent folder. These aren't there. Email can be deleted, sir. Not from the server logs. My email provider can verify I didn't send these. Officer, think about this logically. I have a court hearing in 2 weeks where I'm about to win my case against the HOA. Why on earth would I jeopardize that by sending threatening emails? This is a setup." The officer studied me. "You have a restraining order against them." "Yes." "Temporary restraining order from Judge Martinez in Fulton County Superior Court. They're not allowed to contact me or take any action related to my property. Let me get you a copy." I went inside and retrieved the court order. The officer read it carefully. "If you have a TRO against them, why are they contacting the police about you?" "Because they're trying to make me look like the aggressor." "Officer, can I show you something?" I pulled out my phone and opened my security camera app. I have cameras around my property. "I can show you I haven't left my house today except to go to the store this morning. I definitely haven't been to Deborah Patterson's house." He looked at the footage. "Okay. Sir, I'm going to note in my report that you deny sending the emails and that you have a TRO against the complainant. I'd recommend you contact your attorney and let them know about this. If those emails are fake, that's a serious issue." "Thank you, officer. I appreciate you actually listening." He left, and I immediately called Richard Chen. It was Saturday afternoon, but this couldn't wait. "Vincent, slow down," Richard said after I rapid-fire explained what happened. "Someone is spoofing emails from your account. Has to be. I didn't send them. Forward me the screenshots the officer showed you. This is serious. If Deborah is fabricating evidence, that's fraud, possibly criminal. But we need to prove it. How do we do that?" Email headers. Every email has metadata that shows where it actually originated. If someone spoofed your address, the headers will show it came from a different server. I have a forensic IT consultant I use for cases like this. Send me everything you have, and I'll get him on it Monday morning. I spent the rest of the weekend stressed and paranoid. I changed all my passwords, enabled two-factor authentication on everything, and reviewed my security camera footage obsessively. Sunday evening, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. Against my better judgment, I answered. "Mr. Malone." A woman's voice, older, nervous. "My name is Patricia Winters. I live on Hickory Lane and I'm on the HOA board. I need to talk to you about what's happening." I was immediately suspicious. "If you're on the board, you're covered by the restraining order. You shouldn't be contacting me." "I know, and I'm sorry, but please hear me out. I only have a minute. What Deborah is doing, it's wrong. Those emails you supposedly sent. I was in the room when she and Marcus discussed creating them. They're fake. She had someone spoof them to make you look dangerous." My blood ran cold. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I didn't sign up for fraud. I joined the HOA board to help with community events and keep the neighborhood nice. I didn't sign up to help Deborah wage war on a homeowner who has a legal exemption. She's obsessed, Mr. Malone. This isn't about the rules anymore. It's personal for her. She can't stand that you're standing up to her. Will you testify to this?" I don't know. She'll destroy me if she finds out I talked to you, but I had to warn you, she's not done. She and Marcus are planning something else." "Like what?" "I don't know the details, but please be careful. And maybe, if your lawyer can protect me, I'll testify. I have recordings of board meetings. We record them for minutes, but Deborah doesn't know I keep copies. I have her talking about you, about forcing you out, about how she'll do whatever it takes to make you comply." This was huge. "Patricia, my attorney's name is Richard Chen. Will you call him? He can advise you on witness protection and what your options are. I'll think about it. I have to go." She hung up. I immediately called Richard and left a voicemail about the conversation. Then I sat in my living room, mind racing. Deborah had fabricated evidence. That was a crime. If Patricia's recordings backed up her claims, we had Deborah dead to rights. Monday morning, Richard called me early. "I spoke with Patricia Winters. She's scared but willing to help. She's going to provide us with recordings of HOA board meetings where Deborah discusses targeting you. She also has emails from Deborah to board members laying out a strategy to force you to sell your house. This is incredibly damaging to their case." "What about the fake emails?" My IT consultant confirmed they are spoofed. The email headers show they originated from a commercial VPN service, not your internet service provider. No one with your actual email account sent them. That's identity fraud and possibly criminal impersonation. I'm drafting a motion to submit this evidence to Judge Martinez and requesting sanctions against the HOA and Deborah personally. Sanctions: financial penalties, attorney's fees, potentially even a referral for criminal prosecution. "Vincent, they crossed a line. You don't fabricate evidence. That's not just unethical, it's illegal." The next 2 weeks were a whirlwind. Richard filed his motion, which included Patricia Winters' recordings, the email forensics report, and a detailed timeline of the HOA's harassment. The recordings were damning. In one, Deborah's voice was clear. "I don't care about his stupid old deed. No one defies the HOA on my watch. We'll bury him in legal fees until he gives up." In another, she discussed the plan to fabricate threatening emails. "He'll look unstable. That'll help us argue he's a problem for the neighborhood." Marcus Patterson tried to do damage control, filing a response claiming the recordings were taken out of context and that Deborah's statements were hyperbolic and not meant to be taken literally. But the evidence was overwhelming. The June 15th hearing arrived. This time, the courtroom was fuller. Some of my neighbors showed up, curious about the drama that had consumed Hickory Lane. Patricia Winters sat in the back, looking nervous but determined. Judge Martinez entered, and we all stood. She sat, reviewed the file for a moment, and then looked up with an expression that could only be described as withering. "Before we begin," she said, "I want to address the allegations in Mr. Chen's supplemental motion regarding fabricated evidence. Mr. Patterson, does your client deny creating fake emails purporting to be from Mr. Malone?" Marcus stood slowly. "Your Honor, there may have been a misunderstanding regarding the origin of those emails." "A misunderstanding? That's your defense?" Judge Martinez's tone was icy. "I've reviewed the forensic report. Those emails were spoofed. They didn't come from Mr. Malone. Someone created them to make him appear threatening. And according to recordings provided by a member of your client's own board, Mrs. Patterson discussed fabricating this evidence. Do you deny that?" Deborah was pale, her hands clenched in her lap. Marcus looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. "Your Honor, those recordings were made without knowledge of Georgia is a one-party consent state, Counselor. The recordings are legal. Answer my question." "We dispute the interpretation of those recordings. I listened to them myself. They're pretty clear." Judge Martinez leaned forward. "Here's what I see. A homeowner with a valid perpetual deed exemption from HOA requirements. An HOA that refused to acknowledge that exemption and engaged in a campaign of harassment, trespass, and fraud to force compliance. This isn't a close case, Mr. Patterson. Your client is in the wrong legally and ethically. She signed several documents. I'm issuing a permanent injunction. The Hickory Lane Homeowners Association has no jurisdiction over Mr. Malone's property at 4782 Hickory Lane. They are permanently barred from collecting dues, enforcing regulations, or taking any action related to that property. The exemption in the 1947 deed is valid and enforceable. Furthermore, I'm ordering the HOA to pay Mr. Malone's attorney's fees in full. Mr. Chen, submit your fee statement within 30 days. Richard stood. Thank you, Your Honor. We also request sanctions against Mrs. Patterson personally for fabricating evidence. Granted. Mrs. Patterson, you're ordered to pay a sanction of $5,000 to the court for your conduct in this matter. Additionally, I'm referring this case to the Fulton County District Attorney's Office for investigation of potential criminal charges related to identity fraud and making false police reports. Deborah gasped. Marcus put his hand on her shoulder, but she shook it off, standing abruptly. This is ridiculous. He doesn't belong in our neighborhood. He's ruining property values with his trashy yard and his Mrs. Patterson, sit down and be quiet, Judge Martinez snapped. You're already in enough trouble. Another outburst and I'll hold you in contempt. Deborah sat, tears of rage streaming down her face. I felt a surge of vindication mixed with pity. She'd done this to herself, all because she couldn't accept that someone wasn't under her control. Judge Martinez concluded the hearing. Mr. Malone, your property is exempt. That exemption is perpetual and cannot be overridden. You owe the HOA nothing. If they continue to harass you, contact the court immediately. This matter is closed. We left the courtroom. Richard was shaking my hand, congratulating me. Patricia Winters caught up with us in the hallway. Thank you for your testimony, I told her. That took courage. I'm resigning from the board, she said. I can't be part of this anymore. For what it's worth, most of the neighbors don't care about your fence or your truck. That was all Deborah's crusade. She made it her mission. Over the next few weeks, things quieted down. The Fulton County DA's office did investigate, and while they didn't file criminal charges, they did issue a stern warning to Deborah about the consequences of filing false police reports. The HOA removed my property from their records and sent me a formal letter acknowledging that I was not a member and not subject to their rules. Marcus Patterson's law firm quietly removed itself from representing the HOA, likely to avoid the ethical mess of the conflicts of interest. Deborah resigned as HOA president a month later, claiming health reasons, though everyone knew it was because the other board members forced her out after the court debacle. My legal fees were paid in full by the HOA, which came to just over $20,000. Richard had earned every penny. He'd not only defended my property rights but exposed the fraud and harassment, making sure it was documented and punished. Life on Hickory Lane returned to normal, or at least a new normal. Some neighbors avoided me, whether from embarrassment or lingering loyalty to Deborah, I didn't know. Others stopped by to apologize or express support. One neighbor, an elderly man named Frank who'd lived there almost as long as Harold, brought me a bottle of bourbon and said, "Glad someone finally stood up to that woman. She's needed a reality check for years." I kept my fence the same color. I kept parking my truck in the driveway. I let my grass grow to a reasonable height, though I did hire a landscaping service to repair the damage from when the HOA had scalped my lawn. And I built a new shed, bigger than the last one, just because I could. The 1947 deed now hung framed in my home office, a reminder of the battle I'd fought and won. That yellowed piece of paper with its archaic language and faded ink had been my shield against bureaucratic tyranny. The words in perpetuity had meant exactly what they said: forever. About 6 months after the court case ended, I was working in my yard when a car pulled up. A young couple got out, looking around the neighborhood. They walked up to me. "Excuse me," the man said, "we're looking at houses in the area. Is this a good neighborhood?" I smiled. "Depends on what you're looking for. There's an HOA here, pretty strict from what I understand, but some properties are exempt." I gestured to my house. "Like mine." "How'd you manage that?" the woman asked. "Old deed from 1947. The original property owner negotiated an exemption that runs with the land forever. It's rare, but it's bulletproof." They thanked me and moved on. I watched them go, thinking about how close I'd come to losing that protection, not because it wasn't valid, but because someone decided the rules didn't apply to them. That evening, I sat on my porch with a beer, watching the sun set over my 2 acres. My fence was still the wrong color by HOA standards. My mailbox was still non-regulation. My truck was still parked prominently in the driveway. And it would all stay exactly as I wanted it, forever, because of a promise made 78 years ago by people who understood that some rights should be permanent. The HOA had tried to force me to join after rezoning. They'd harassed me, trespassed on my property, fabricated evidence, and threatened to take my home. But in the end, my attorney had proved what that old deed had always said. My property was exempt in perpetuity. No rezoning, no HOA president on a power trip, no amount of legal maneuvering could change that fundamental fact. I raised my beer to Harold, the old man who'd sold me this property, and told me its stories. He'd known about the exemption, had lived under its protection his whole life. Now it was my turn to be the guardian of this little piece of freedom. In a neighborhood of conformity, where every mailbox had to match and every lawn had to be exactly 3 inches, my property stood as a monument to the principle that some rights, once granted, cannot be taken away. The HOA had learned that lesson the hard way. Judge Martinez had made sure of it. As darkness fell and the streetlights came on, illuminating the uniform houses of Hickory Lane, my porch light shone on a fence that was the wrong color, a truck that violated regulations, and a house that belonged entirely to me, free from the tyranny of petty rules and power-hungry board members. The battle had been exhausting, stressful, and at times frightening, But it had been worth it, because in the end I hadn't just won a court case. I defended a principle. That property rights matter, that legal documents mean what they say, and that no organization, no matter how powerful it thinks it is, can override the law. Deborah Patterson had tried to force my compliance. She'd tried intimidation, harassment, fraud, and legal manipulation. She'd thrown everything she had at me, convinced that her authority as HOA president made her untouchable. But she'd learned what every petty tyrant eventually learns. Authority without legal foundation is nothing but bullying, and bullies eventually meet someone who won't be bullied. The permanent injunction meant I would never have to fight this battle again. Future HOA boards couldn't revisit the issue. The matter was settled, permanently, irrevocably. My property was exempt in perpetuity, and no one could ever change that. I finished my beer and went inside, locking the door behind me. Tomorrow I'd wake up in my house, on my land, free from HOA rules, just as I had every right to be. The nightmare was over. The victory was complete. And that yellow deed from 1947, now framed and hanging on my wall, would stand as a permanent reminder that sometimes history protects us in ways we never expect. The story of my battle with the Hickory Lane HOA spread through Roswell and beyond. Richard Chen told me he'd received calls from other homeowners facing similar situations, people with old properties and unusual deed restrictions who were being pressured by HOAs. My case had become a precedent, a template for how to fight back when an association overstepped its authority. A local newspaper ran a story about it, focusing on the historical aspect of the 1947 exemption and how deed restrictions from that era were still relevant today. The reporter interviewed me, Richard, and even Patricia Winters, who spoke about the need for HOA accountability. The article painted Deborah in an unflattering light, describing her campaign against me as obsessive and legally groundless. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that Deborah and Marcus had put their house on the market. Whether it was from embarrassment, the financial hit from the sanctions and attorneys' fees, or just the uncomfortable reality of living in a neighborhood where everyone knew what she'd done, I didn't know. Part of me felt bad for her. She destroyed her own reputation and her standing in the community over something that had never been hers to control in the first place. But a larger part of me remembered the stress, the fear, the constant harassment. I remembered coming home to find strangers mowing my lawn without permission. I remembered the tow truck in my driveway and the police officer showing me fake emails I supposedly sent. I remembered lying awake at night wondering what they'd do next, so my sympathy for Deborah Patterson was limited. A few months after everything was settled, I was at the hardware store buying supplies for a new project, a workshop I was building in my backyard. Definitely not HOA-approved dimensions, when I ran into Frank, my elderly neighbor with the bourbon. "Vincent, good to see you," he said, shaking my hand. "How's everything?" "Quiet, finally. How about you?" "Good, good. Listen, I wanted to tell you something. The HOA had an election. New board, new president. Woman named Susan Garcia, very reasonable. She sent a letter to all the members basically apologizing for what happened with you and promising a new direction. Focus on actual community building, not enforcement for enforcement's sake." "That's good to hear." "It is. You know, what you did, standing up to Deborah, it changed things." People saw what happens when the HOA has too much power and no accountability. The new board is actually following the rules now, not making them up as they go. Frank smiled. "So thanks for that. You did the whole neighborhood a favor, even if some folks are too proud to admit it." We talked for a few more minutes before parting ways. As I drove home, I thought about what Frank had said. I hadn't set out to reform the HOA or teach anyone a lesson. I just wanted to protect my property and my rights. But sometimes, standing up for yourself has ripple effects you never intended. That evening, I worked on my workshop. The foundation was poured and I was framing the walls. It was going to be bigger than HOA regulations would have allowed, with higher ceilings and a garage door that faced the street. I could build it however I wanted because my property was mine, truly mine, in a way that few properties in HOA-controlled neighborhoods are. As I worked, I thought about the concept of perpetuity. Forever. The people who created that deed exemption in 1947 couldn't have imagined what Hickory Lane would look like in 2026. They couldn't have foreseen the rise of HOAs and their strict control over residential properties. But they'd had the foresight to protect this particular piece of land, this original farmhouse with its natural water source, from future restrictions. Maybe they'd seen enough of people trying to control others. Maybe they'd understood that some places needed to remain free. Whatever their reasoning, I was grateful. That exemption had saved my home and my sanity. I finished the framing as the sun set, stepping back to admire my work. The workshop was taking shape, a testament to my freedom to build what I wanted on my own land. No permission needed from a board. No compliance with arbitrary regulations. Just a man building a structure on his property as it should be. Inside, I made dinner and sat down with the stack of documents from the court case. Richard had sent me copies of everything, organized in a binder. I flipped through it, reading Judge Martinez's final order again. Her words were clear and unequivocal. The exemption was valid. The HOA had no authority. The harassment and fraud were unacceptable. Justice had been served. I thought about all the people who face similar situations, but don't have an exemption to protect them. People who buy homes in HOA communities and then find themselves at the mercy of petty tyrants like Deborah Patterson. Unable to paint their front door the color they want or plant the flowers they prefer. The American dream of homeownership, constrained by endless rules and the constant threat of fines or liens. My situation was unique because of that old deed, but the principle wasn't. Property rights matter. Individual freedom matters. The ability to live in your home without constant interference matters. HOAs serve a purpose, maintaining common areas and protecting property values, but when they become vehicles for control freaks to exercise power over their neighbors, they become tyrannical. I closed the binder and put it away. The legal battle was over. I'd won completely, permanently. Now it was time to simply enjoy that victory and live my life. Over the following year, life on Hickory Lane continued peacefully. The new HOA board under Susan Garcia's leadership was actually competent and reasonable. They focused on organizing neighborhood events, maintaining the common areas, and handling legitimate concerns without the authoritarian overreach that had characterized Deborah's tenure. My workshop was completed, and I spent many happy hours there working on various projects. I built furniture, restored old tools, and generally enjoyed having a space that was entirely my own creation. Neighbors would occasionally stop by to see what I was working on, and I'd give them tours, always mentioning that the structure wouldn't have been allowed under HOA rules, but thanks to my exemption, I could build it exactly as I wanted. Some people seemed envious, wishing they had similar protections. Others accepted it as just one of those quirks that make neighborhoods interesting. A few, I suspect, still harbored resentment that I wasn't subject to the same rules as everyone else, but they kept it to themselves. Deborah and Marcus did sell their house. A nice young family moved in, completely unaware of the drama that had preceded them. I welcomed them to the neighborhood, and they were friendly, normal people who just wanted a nice place to raise their kids. No power trips, no obsessions with control. Just regular folks. I heard through Frank that Deborah had moved to a gated community in Alpharetta, a place with even stricter HOA rules than Hickory Lane. I found it ironic that someone who tried to force rules on others now lived in a place where she was subject to even more regulations. Maybe she liked it. Maybe she finally found a place where everyone thought like her. Or maybe she'd learned nothing and was already plotting to take over that HOA board too. Either way, it was no longer my problem. Richard Chen and I stayed in touch. He'd handled a few more cases similar to mine. Using the precedent we'd set to defend other homeowners with historical deed restrictions or exemptions. He told me that my case had become something of a landmark in Georgia property law circles, cited in legal journals, and taught in property law classes as an example of how deed restrictions can protect homeowners from HOA overreach. I never imagined I'd become a case study, but if my battle helped other people defend their property rights, I was glad. No one should have to go through what I went through, but if they did, at least now there was a clear legal pathway to fight back. 2 years after the court case, on a warm spring evening, I hosted a barbecue in my backyard. Frank came, along with several other neighbors who'd been supportive during my battle with the HOA. Susan Garcia, the new HOA president, even stopped by briefly to introduce herself formally and assure me that the association had no interest in revisiting the exemption issue. "Your property is your property," she said simply. "The previous board should have accepted that from the beginning." "We've moved on." "I appreciate that," I told her, "and I appreciate the new direction the HOA has taken. You're doing it right," she smiled. "We're trying. Turns out people are happier when you treat them like adults instead of subjects." As the evening wore on and people mingled in my yard, eating burgers and drinking beer, I looked around at my property. The fence I'd never repainted, the mailbox I'd never replaced, the truck in the driveway, the oversized workshop. The grass that was maybe a little longer than 3 inches but looked healthy and green. Everything was exactly as I wanted it, and it would stay that way forever. In perpetuity. Those words had power, legal weight that not even rezoning could overcome. That old deed, created by people I'd never met for reasons I could only guess at, had become my shield against the modern phenomenon of HOA tyranny. I raised my beer in a silent toast to Harold, the old man who'd lived here before me, and preserved the property's character for 60 years. To the original landowners who'd had the foresight to protect this land. To Richard Chen, who'd fought the legal battle with skill and determination. To Patricia Winters, who'd found the courage to do the right thing. And to Judge Martinez, who'd seen through the HOA's arguments and ruled based on law rather than convenience. But mostly, I toasted to the principle that had won the day, that property rights are fundamental, that legal documents mean what they say, and that perpetuity means forever. The Hickory Lane HOA had tried to force me to join after rezoning. They'd thrown everything at me, from harassment to fraud. But my attorney had proved what that deed had always promised. My property was exempt in perpetuity, and no power on earth could change that. As the sun set over my 2 acres and my guests laughed and talked, I felt profound gratitude for that protection and profound satisfaction in having defended it. The battle had been difficult, but victory was sweet. My home was mine, truly and completely mine, free from the tyranny of arbitrary rules and power-hungry board members. And that, I realized, was what the American dream really meant. Not perfection, not conformity, not neat rows of identical houses with regulation mailboxes, but freedom. The freedom to live in your home as you choose, to make it your own, to be secure in your property rights against those who would strip them away. The Hickory Lane HOA had learned that lesson the hard way, and thanks to the permanent injunction, they would never forget it. My property would remain exempt forever, exactly as that 1947 deed promised. Perpetuity indeed.